Welcome to ZEBx's Decarb Lunch series. My name is Natalie Douglas, and I'm the program manager for ZEBx at the Zero Emissions Innovation Center if you're new here. Today, we're hosting a conversation about thermal safety and cooling strategies for multi-unit residential buildings with two of the key authors of the report that you might have remember seeing published back earlier this year by Metro Vancouver. The webinar does not seek to summarize the whole policy-focused report, but instead will seek to draw out highlights and build off elements from the report to be of help to building practitioners like yourself. Now, to kick off things in a good way, I'd first like to thank or share my thanks for being able to join today from the unceded traditional territories of the Musqueam, the Squamish, and the Tsleil-Waututh Nations, and to thank the City of Vancouver, NRCan, and BC Hydro for their financial support that allows us to offer webinars like these at no cost to you. If you're interested in getting continuing education credits for attending today's webinar, you can see some information that my colleague Carrie is going to pop into the chat. If you haven't joined us before, know that the chat function on the side here is you can use it throughout the session to comment and ask questions for the presenters and for the benefit of really the rest of the audience who likely will have something helpful to contribute. So we'll use these questions and comments to help guide discussion near the end of the hour. And at this point, my colleague Carrie is now going to launch our first poll to get us a sense of who is in the room. And with that, I'm going to pass things over to Lisa Westerhoff, principal owner and founder of Westerhoff Climate Strategies. Over to you, Lisa.
Thanks so much, Natalie, and hello, everyone. It's nice to be here with you today. So as Natalie just said, I'm here co-presenting with my colleague Susan from Focal Engineering. We are going to be talking to you a little bit about the work and the insights that we derived working on this thermal safety in existing MURB or multi-unit residential buildings. I just want to, before we kind of dive into it, I wanted to just make a quick note that this was actually a three-part team made up of myself, of Susan and her colleagues at Focal Engineering, but also of the good people at Introba. So while they're not presenting today, I just wanted to make sure that everyone knows that they were part of this work as well. So we're going to break the presentation into three parts today. So I'll start with a bit of an overview of the background and the purpose of the report. So what prompted the need for it, and I'll go over that pretty quickly. I'll then pass it over to Susan, who will get more into the details of how we actually define thermal safety, and we'll review a method of assessing thermal safety in existing multifamily buildings. And then I'll take it back over and bring it more into a bit of the policy realm and highlight some of the key recommendations that came out of the report. And then, of course, we'll have a little bit of discussion at the end. Okay, so why did we write this report? So the foundation of this work and of lots of work that's being done in the same space right now is primarily the recognition that our summers are getting hotter. So I've often seen referenced the heat dome event in 2021 as, sort of a foundation for why we need to care about this. That was an undeniably terrible event that brought record high temperatures across the province. We also saw a record number of heat-related deaths. But we don't even have to point to that particular moment in time, that particular event anymore to note that this is a thing that's happening. We can just look at our own experience year after year, including this year, which was another example of a very hot and smoky summer. And so what does that mean for buildings? As we now know, high summer temperatures and extreme heat events can really negatively impact people living in multi-unit residential buildings. That's primarily the reason for which is because these buildings were simply not designed to withstand these kinds of temperatures. They were designed with cooler climates in mind. And so that's translating into not just higher outdoor temperatures, but higher indoor temperatures in many buildings and units. And that's making them not just uncomfortable, but also unsafe in some situations. The impacts of these summer temperatures are, of course, not experienced uniformly across the population. We know that the elderly, people with experiencing social isolation, people with pre-existing health conditions, and others are all more likely to experience these kinds of adverse health effects. And that's especially the case when temperatures remain over 26 degrees Celsius for prolonged periods of time or even overnight. Of course, we also know that it is also likely going to get hotter. So given the absence of any kind of coordinated global, national, or even local or provincial action on emissions reductions generally across our communities. We know that the trend of increasing summer temperatures and extreme heat events is only likely to increase into the future. So the way that I've heard this said before is that basically today's hottest days are going to be tomorrow's balmy weather. So we know that this is getting worse over time. So that's really the background for why we embarked on this project. It was actually a consortium of the City of North Vancouver, Vancouver Coastal Health, Metro Vancouver, and the City of Vancouver who came together to commission this work. And big kudos to them for really seeing the need in this space. And so we worked with them to ultimately create this report that outlined a suite of actions that was generally focused on what local and regional authorities could do. However, we also want to emphasize that industry partners play a huge role. What they can do or what kind of actions they can take in the short to medium term, so between now and 2030, to really look at safeguarding the thermal safety of the occupants of multi-unit residential buildings. And this also focused mainly in the Lower Mainland, but a lot of the actions that came out of this work are broadly applicable across the province and actually elsewhere. You may be asking yourself, why am I attending a decarb lunch and she's not talking about decarbonization? Well, this issue is of course important on its own, but it's also worth noting that a lot of the actions that can be taken to improve thermal safety in existing buildings actually overlap or dovetail to a great extent with those that might be taken to move buildings towards electrification or to achieve decarbonization outcomes. So when we created this report, we really tried to strike a balance between, not inadvertently creating any consequences for things like electrification by focusing on thermal safety, but also looking at areas that were sort of complementary to all three of these. We also considered a number of other goals that are on the right-hand side, but I won't go into those in detail. We also made sure to build on the existing landscape. So hopefully, as many of you are aware, there's lots of policies, programs that either directly or indirectly start to address this issue of thermal safety in existing multifamily buildings. So things like utility programs like BC Hydro's free portable air conditioner program, as well as provincial requirements like the building code update and other programmatic offers that exist out there are all starting to move us in the right direction. But we also noted that there was still a lot of work that could still be done to help support thermal safety in existing multifamily buildings. So just as a quick summary of where that report went, and I'll go into a little bit more detail on some of the actions towards the end of the presentation, but just to say at this point that we looked at different suite of 31 actions at the end of the day that fell into one of 4 buckets. So we looked at actions that would help to increase the awareness and capacity of owners and tenants to address thermal safety needs. We looked at actions that fell under the policy and legislation bucket, so things around changing decision-making structures and addressing low uptake of thermal safety retrofits. We looked at actions to address potential impacts on capital and operating costs, including for tenants. So when we actually want to see those retrofits happen, who bears the cost and how can we adjust that? And then finally, we looked at actions that fall under the category of industry and technology. So actions that can address instances of low industry expertise or even availability and just generally improve the market, the availability of products. So we're gonna sort of, where we're going next is gonna start in that last bucket. So this was a bit of an overview of what the report contains and sort of the rationale for it. I'm gonna now pass it on over to Susan, who's going to take you through a little bit more of, I would say, a deeper dive into how we define thermal safety and how it can actually be integrated into existing buildings. So over to you, Susan.
Thanks so much, Lisa. And thanks everyone for coming as well. And welcome. My name is Susan MacDougall, and I'm a principal and founder of Focal Engineering. So as Lisa has given you all a background on, this project is really focused on effectiveness in addressing overheating. And she looked at it for sort of more from the policy lens, whereas our team and the folks at Introbo, we were helping lead the look through the technical lens. So I'm going to share some of our findings of the technical solutions that we reviewed and discuss how we assess those various effectiveness in supporting thermal safety in MURBS. Now, to kick things off, we really needed to shift our thinking about how we design and retrofit and generally consider what's reasonable to expect temperature-wise for buildings. Because as a mechanical engineer, we're used to designing for thermal comfort, which is defined as a condition in which building occupants generally feel satisfied with the indoor conditions, so temperature, humidity, etc. And this can be based on personal scenarios and a range of activities from working to working out to sleeping. But as we embarked on this study, we really needed to start shifting the focus more towards this concept of thermal safety. And so we looked at defining that for the purpose of the study more as a state in which indoor conditions are maintained where temperature thresholds will prevent adverse health effects for occupants. So there may be some overlap between a thermally comfortable and a thermally safe space, but there also may not, and that's going to differ from person to person because comfort does differ for individuals. And so in order to evaluate technical measures for this study, what we did was use the 26-degree dry bulb limit that Lisa mentioned earlier, came through the recent requirement of BCBC for one space in a new construction MURB to be able to maintain that throughout the year. So that was basically how we kind of set our quantitative limit for thermal safety. And what we did next was look at the question, which retrofit technologies are going to be the most effective at achieving thermal safety in an existing MURB? So fortunately, I know we've painted a bit of a bleak picture till now, but the measures and technologies that we are going to need to achieve thermal safety are generally well known. So they're going to range in effectiveness depending on buildings and their location and the occupants. But we generally looked at this large group of measures and grouped them into 5 main categories. So the first one, I think we're talking to a fairly technical audience, but active cooling measures. So anything removing heat from the space and cooling it to achieve the desired temperature using electric heat pumps. We did obviously focus on electric per Lisa's earlier comments about not wanting to adversely increase emissions elsewhere. We also looked at passive strategies, so either reducing solar heat gains, so the heat that would come from solar radiation into a building, and measures that improve airflow. So anything that kind of allows air movement to dissipate heat that is built up within the space, whether that heat is from solar gains or from something else like internal gains, cooking, other activities that are going on inside the building. Next, we looked at a category of interim solutions. So these could be active or passive measures that can temporarily or partially mitigate overheating risk while exploring longer-term solutions. So for existing MURBs, a good example of this might be looking at adding cooling to a corridor makeup air unit. Is that going to keep every space at 26 degrees? Probably not, but it is the way of adding a little bit of cooling to a building if overheating is extreme and measures need to be looked at right away. And finally, we couldn't forget about co-benefit solutions. So those that support thermal safety, but may be targeted towards other improvements such as envelope or things like having vegetation near buildings, which we know reduces heat island effect and removes carbon from the air, but isn't necessarily going to be a guaranteed solution to meet that 26-degree dry bulb limit. So within each category, of course, there's again a range of measures. And so we looked at a variety for the study. So for example, this top row here, we looked at, for active mechanical cooling, we looked at a range of heat pumps. So things from as small as portable units that might cool a single room, to split systems that might be able to handle an entire unit, to central systems, if buildings maybe already have centralized conditioning systems. And so while we identified that heat pumps as a group are the most effective tool for achieving thermal safeties, each individual example will have a different range of effectiveness. So a portable unit may be too small for a certain suite, or may be challenging for a tenant to set up and use if they have accessibility challenges. But of course, they'll be the least invasive to occupants because you don't need to be opening drywall and ceilings and things to install a portable unit. On the flip side, a central system, if you're trying to retrofit a central system, that also has a lot of challenges. A lot of central heating systems won't have been designed with cooling in mind. And so they may not have pipes insulated, which would prevent condensation from the walls. So those are going to be a very much more invasive and probably more costlier upgrade, but it's still something to consider as we're trading off what are the options for each MURB to look at. Now for the air quality assessment, this piece was led by Introba. We also looked at filtration opportunities that could be retrofit into an existing airside mechanical equipment. So that's that first row up there. If you already have existing equipment versus in-space filtration. So bringing in some sort of portable air filters with a HEPA filter that can be swapped out. So you can see that with these two tables, we went through a lot of measures in detail, and we obviously can't look at all of these today in one short presentation, but this was kind of the basis of the technical analysis that we did as part of this project. And then after listing out all of these different measures and grouping them into the 5 main categories, what we did was evaluate those on a range of sort of topics that we've shown here. And Lisa also touched on those earlier. So of course, the first one is the basis of the project, health and safety. So the thermal safety that these measures can achieve and the indoor air quality environment that they can set. But we also didn't want to lose sight of sustainability. What is the energy impact of some of these retrofit measures, and also the carbon impact of emissions associated with those upgrades? Equity was a really important one. So things like ownership structure. Are we talking about a tenant-landlord situation, or a cooperative or strata, all of which come with their own challenges and benefits? And also accessibility, so making sure that people are comfortable with the equipment that they get and that they have the ability to use it and operate it properly. Of course, no study would be complete without looking at costs, so we did a light touch analysis on the capital cost and operating cost. And then we also looked at just ease of use of these different measures. So what's the local availability? What are maintenance opportunities? And I know the engineers in the room will feel me on this, but we basically landed on this concept that because each building has such unique conditions, individual assessment is really going to be required to figure out what is going to be the best approach for each building. And so the last step that we took was trying to develop this basic process that every building can go through to find out what are the best measures to undertake for thermal safety in their particular circumstances. So we came up with this it's a very light touch, but again, kind of broad plan on how do you integrate cooling measures into retrofits. There we go. I somehow jumped to displayed all of my answers right there. So of course we started by laying out what would be the ideal pathway. So we would really like to start by planning upgrades and then budgeting appropriately. So in an ideal world, we would look at passive strategies first. Let's block those solar gains. Let's improve airflow. And both of those can often be achieved by window upgrades, which can help extend any passive cooling life that the building may have as the climate warms, and also reduce loads on active cooling. Next, ideally, if we have time, we would plan some interim approach to preparing to add active cooling. So we should load shed at our building. So add electrical capacity, and then add any interim cooling solutions as well as needed. And then the final stage is to add mechanical cooling based on the building's needs. And if possible, it's nice when you can add from the worst suites first, because that means that it's less of a capital upfront cost for building owners. But of course, there's pros and cons again to that, to having services come back to site to add things on multiple occasions. So again, it's going to be a very individual approach for each building as to what's best. So what we wanted to do was really get to the meat of things and figure out what are the right questions to be asking up front when you're planning so that you're prepared to deliver when the appropriate time comes. So first we want to look at how is the building overheating and what is causing it. So is the overheating mild? Is it moderate or severe? And this is important because the most effective strategies are going to depend on that root cause. Are we trying to block solar gains, or is doing that going to be very ineffective because that's not the reason, the building is having challenges. We also want to look at who's being affected. So are there more vulnerable populations in the building, or who location-wise in the building? Is it just the top floors that are having challenges, or is it sort of uniform, or maybe just the south facade? Next, we have to look at what are the building's realistic constraints. So what is the budget today and also planned out? Hopefully they'll have a depreciation report that will help inform some of that. I mean, by now they would. Again, I touched on earlier, what are the ownership structure, but also what planned upgrades are in the works. And this is a really important one. This came up so many times with all of the industry experts who we worked with, that of course it's the most effective, cost-effective, and just least invasive to owners to do upgrades when they're already planned or needed. So the idea behind this whole planning first was really to be ready so that when upgrades come along, people are ready to add on the cooling piece, whether they're upgrading because of failure or for other motivations. And finally, of course, we want to explore those potential solutions. So look into the passive measures. If we know that the end goal is going to be adding cooling for a particular building, then let's think early on about adding electrical capacity if that's necessary, and getting that study in the works so that we can have the answers and we're not delaying things when retrofits come up. So yeah, I'm going to end things with two examples of two buildings that we looked at using this pathway approach. So the first one is a Kitsilano low-rise. It's a 4-story, 8-unit built in 1989. It's got electric baseboards and a gas fireplace with individual domestic hot water that's electric in each unit. And all the units are long and narrow, so they only have one-sided ventilation. And what we were finding was that the top floors were overheating. This particular building is strataed with a limited budget and no planned upgrades. So how would they go about addressing overheating in the sort of short to medium term? So first of all, we kind of looked at what's the overall plan for them. Well, the overheating isn't too extreme, so it's reasonable to expect that we can budget to make these upgrades in the next 5 to 10 years, but not having to do anything for next summer because people are in such a state of discomfort or unsafety, I guess. Next, what can we do to help look at passive measures for this project? And so we happen to have some pricing for this one, and we looked at exterior shades, which would be about $3,000 per unit. And because these are long, narrow units with only one south and north facade, it was actually not as expensive for them to address those. And that would be a way for them to extend out the life of the passive cooling that they've got on the building. We also looked at them potentially upgrading the upper units first, which are overheating more, and then following with the lower units later if capital costs were an issue. In the meantime, we recommended that the strata encourage everyone to load shed as much as possible. So where they can, put in LED lights. Whenever appliances come up for renewal, looking for lower electrical demand ones, and potentially exploring domestic hot water heat pumps, because each unit has its own electric baseboards and electric resistance hot water heating. That would be a way to free up some electrical capacity. And then finally, we looked at adding mechanical cooling. So this would not be a small number, even for this small building. It was looking at the time at around $12,000 per unit. So it's the kind of thing, again, we would recommend the strata start budgeting for today to maybe upgrade in 5 to 8, 10 years. Again, perhaps starting with the top floors and moving to the lower floors if necessary to try to keep budgets more reasonable. So that was our example where there's a little bit more time, even though there wasn't any budget. And then we looked at this alternative example of a high-rise in Cold Harbor. So this one has 25 plus stories, 175 units, about the same era. But you can see it's obviously got much more glazing and window wall style envelope. Now, I should say that this example was one that we tweaked based on a couple of different scenarios. So this is not an actual building. So if you recognize it, that's this is not specific to your building or the one that you might know. But we assume that they've got some sort of central heating system. And we assumed, and we were actually able to verify that severe overheating is happening. We looked at a few MLS listings for a few real buildings, and you could see the portable ACs everywhere. So people are needing them right away. So again, this is a scenario where we really want the strata to be aware they need to start planning for major upgrades. A couple of other things we thought they could do right up front was making sure that the bylaws allow for cooling. Lisa will probably touch on this, but or may not. But we saw this a lot when we were talking to folks for this this report. But some of the stories we heard about people saying, "I'd like to add cooling, but my strata won't allow it." Those kind of barriers should be removed right at the start, so that at least people who have the capacity to do this can do that themselves. Ahead of the strata making any global changes. And then similarly, if they are going to be switching from a kind of gas-based system to electric, then something the strata may want to do to encourage is, again, look at an electrical capacity study very early on. For this building type, they could look at some interim solutions like adding that central makeup air unit cooling, maybe even cooling the amenity room so that on a really hot day, people have a place of refuge where they can go. And again, they want to be educating strata members on night cooling and load shedding and other portable units and ways that people can stay cool in the interim. As for adding mechanical cooling, again, there's the opportunity to prioritize the most severe areas. If the strata can agree on that, that can be challenging for sure. But again, just re-emphasizing, making sure that owners are allowed to add cooling if they're capable is really important. And then finally, because this building is, 40-year-old window wall, at some point in the next arguably 10-ish years, 15 years, it's going to reach its end of life and need some renewal for the envelope. And so they should really look at planning ahead at that point. And of course, improving glazing is a great way to do that. Better U value, lower solar heat gain coefficient, maybe even adding some more operable windows for natural ventilation. However, we also came out of this study with some thoughts to adding things like opaque panels to both reduce the amount of solar gains entering a space, but also they can be set up to add future cooling ports. And finally, considering shading when they make those envelope changes. So in a nutshell, that's some of the technical recommendations that we walked away with from the study. They're not all in the report because the report was more policy-based. So I'm going to hand things over to Lisa, who's going to be able to share that information.
Thanks, Susan. And hopefully that satisfied all of the sort of building designers, modelers, those who get into the weeds. I definitely see some good questions in the chat that Susan, you'll want to take a skim through. But now I'm going to take it in a completely different, well, not completely different direction, but definitely at a different scale. And looking at some of the priority recommendations that came out of the policy toolkit that we identified that really, we look at some of the case studies and the measures that are required, but how do you actually encourage or incentivize or even require these kinds of studies, plans, audits, and upgrades to actually happen? So what are we actually saying that local and regional governments and others can do to actually encourage thermal safety measures be adopted? So as I mentioned a little earlier in the presentation, we grouped the 31 actions that came out of the report under these 4 broad buckets around awareness and capacity, policy and legislation, funding and finance, and industry and technology. But of those 31 actions, there were actually 8 that floated to the top that were determined to be sort of higher priority actions that could help to move the needle sooner and actually help to address some of the more fundamental barriers that folks encounter. So I'm just going to walk you through those priority actions and hope that you will look at the report for the others that we're not going to cover today. So the first one that really comes out of the report, and actually there was a number of priority actions that fall under this awareness and capacity umbrella. And I think that's, generally in recognition of the fact that we can't really expect movement on anything that folks don't have a good understanding of or access to support on. So the first one here really was around providing educational materials for building owners. So having those be differentiated between rental owners as well as strata, acknowledging that some of the challenges that they face may be slightly different, some of their priorities are slightly different, but making sure that that information is consistent and gives them a really good understanding of what do we even mean when we say thermal safety, and what are the risks associated with high indoor temperatures? How might it affect your tenants, for example? We want to let them know what the current landscape is about thermal safety. So are there any kinds of incoming requirements? As of right now, we just have the requirement from the BC Building Code for new buildings, but is there anything coming down the pike that they should be aware of? These can be broadly, applied, these kinds of steps, to not just British Columbian authorities, but to others elsewhere as well. We want them to make sure we want to make sure they have a really good understanding of the co-benefits and the risks of thermal safety upgrades. So they should really understand what sort of other solutions or other priorities they can meet in terms of either decarbonization or improved air quality. But they also might want to be aware of the risks that are associated with potentially higher utility costs. Things like temporary measures, so what can they do in the interim to help protect their tenants and safeguard against sort of health emergencies? So what are those things that they can do immediately versus what are some of the longer term upgrades that they should be looking at, including things like potential cost, guidance on installation, technologies even to avoid, and how to plan for those to meet the building's cooling needs in the longer term, things like what Susan already described. So that's kind of step one, making sure that owners, or not step one, but a priority action that we outlined in the report. A second important piece of the puzzle is to make sure that tenants also understand the risks of thermal safety. So you can see on the screen here an example from Vancouver Coastal Health, alerting folks as to the potential risks and the symptoms of extreme heat. So we want to make sure that tenants, especially those in higher risk buildings, have the information on how they can stay safe under extreme heat, that they are aware of some of the more cost-effective, low or no cost cooling and ventilation measures that they can take, as well as some other appropriate temporary measures, so things that will really help them in the interim. Guidance on the proper installation of those measures, so and again, what kinds of things to avoid that might inadvertently have the adverse effect or the inverse effect of what they're looking for. And these last two are really, sort of still a challenging area, I would say, but really having some clarity on the roles of responsibilities of themselves versus their landlords in the case of rental buildings. And in some areas, how to ask for and hold landlords accountable. I didn't include this example on the screen, but we actually ended up working with a number of other cities across North America and looked at examples of this kind of work in other jurisdictions. And one example that I can offer here too is that the city of Phoenix, which has an actual indoor temperature requirement, issued great information to city tenants that living across the city, that they had a very clear understanding of what the incoming requirement was, what the responsibilities of their landlords were, and what their rights were, and how to report infractions to that requirement. So in the event that something like this should come into play, it would be really important for tenants to know what is required. These are two additional actions from under the awareness and capacity umbrella. So the one on the right is all about developing a means of signaling which buildings, and we focused on rental buildings here, have active cooling systems so that prospective tenants know what they're kind of getting into. Like many other areas, many other kind of priorities that we would like to look at, for example, decarbonization or electrification, there just simply isn't the information out there for tenants to kind of understand what their options are, what kind of building that they may be renting into. So we identified an action to work with, between local or regional authorities and industry partners to develop some kind of either social media or a labeling campaign where rental building owners can signal to prospective tenants that they actually do have cooling in their building. ahead of time. So something that would be easy for folks to find, say in a search field on a platform like PadMapper. You may also even look at some sort of like a labeling, a voluntary labeling program, lots of different options, but essentially getting that information out there so tenants know what is available and that they can look for that. The second action on the right-hand side of the screen is really around requiring now building owners to report and disclose any existence of unit level cooling. Now, benchmarking and reporting requirements for existing buildings exist in the City of Vancouver, as many of you I'm sure are aware. You may not be aware that those sort of reporting requirements for larger buildings are also coming into play in the City of Victoria and the District of Saanich. Lots of other jurisdictions looking at this across BC and North America. And so our idea here is that, you know, whether it's a requirement or it's a voluntary program like Building Benchmark BC or something else, there is a possibility that more cooling information, information on which buildings have cooling could be provided to authorities having jurisdiction via an existing reporting requirement like this one, just by looking at making sure the percent cooled field in Energy Star Portfolio Manager is a required data point to collect. So this is more around the awareness and understanding of thermal safety needs on the part of the authorities having jurisdiction rather than the tenants or the occupants themselves, but it helps to start to identify where priority buildings that may have risks of thermal safety exist. Also under that umbrella action of awareness and capacity is a recommended action to conduct or commission a set of studies designed to identify where cooling efforts could be directed. So kind of relates to the last point on, reporting requirements around cooling. This is starting to look more at, can we get a regional or even local sense of where those high risk buildings or even neighborhoods are. And a couple examples on the screen here from New York City and Washington, DC. They use things like the heat vulnerability index map or a heat sensitivity exposure index to start to look at areas that might have higher heat exposure, as well as in some places, in the case of Washington, a concentration of heat sensitive residents. So looking at pulling different sources of information, leveraging existing data sets wherever possible, like things like 2021 heat dome emergency service reports, perhaps, to identify where those high risk areas are so we can start to provide support to them more directly, or at least in a priority fashion. All right, moving away from awareness and capacity and more into the policy and legislative actions section. The two actions that I have bolded here on the screen are the two additional priority recommendations that came out of the report. So establishing a maximum indoor temperature limit or requirement, and then removing policy barriers to cooling measures. And you can actually see I've put these more on a bit of a continuum or a gradient because there's lots of different ways of kind of considering how to approach thermal safety from a regulatory perspective. If you actually start at that bottom, sort of that first rung, removing policy barriers to cooling measures, that's in part what Susan was referencing when we look at things like strata bylaws that prevent the installation of cooling, for example. So some of these are out of the purview of a local government, of an authority having jurisdiction, but some of them actually do. There may be some areas where local governments can actually look to adjust or remove any kinds of policy barriers that may inadvertently be preventing cooling from being implemented easily. So things like form and character bylaws, property standards bylaws, design covenants, and others. So that's sort of as a foundation. Then you can sort of start to go up there in terms of stringency. So we're seeing more and more jurisdictions doing things, putting in requirements for ensuring tenants have access to at least a cooling room in the building, as again, as Susan mentioned, a cooling sort of in the amenity space of a building. That comes with some concerns around accessibility and realistic use of that kind of a space. So then others are looking at things like requiring maintenance of existing air conditioning units or operable windows. So if you have air conditioning, make sure it's working. But establishing a maximum indoor temperature limit or even requiring flat out installation of active cooling are other measures that local governments across North America are exploring. And that would ensure, or that would require owners to make sure that temperatures stay below a certain threshold, say 26 degrees Celsius in each unit. So lots of things to consider, and folks are actively looking at that. I'll just show very quickly that there are actually a number of jurisdictions right now who have either adopted or are considering some form of maximum indoor temperature or cooling requirement, and in some form. So I saw some chatter in the thread around Phoenix as being one of the areas. I also was mentioning Phoenix earlier. You can kind of see like Phoenix, Tempe, Los Angeles. Some of these places are quite hot, lots of places in Texas. So it makes sense that they should be sort of first out of the gate with some of these requirements, but we're also seeing things emerge in cooler climates as well. And then finally, and certainly not least of all, is the money. As folks have noted, there are significant cost implications for actually making some of these things happen. So one of the key recommendations in the report was all around leveraging any kind of financial tool that exists. I mean, here it says municipal sphere of control, but really I think it could be regional, it could be provincial, it could be federal as well. And so looking at things like leveraging, expanding on, or even promoting existing support programs that can help to improve energy efficiency and install passive measures, perhaps shift over to heat pumps that provide cooling, but also exploring potentially new sources of funding. So things like that could be tied more specifically to public health and safety, as opposed to hitchhiking on electrification or decarbonization or energy efficiency approaches. And also providing support more specifically for some of those interim steps that can provide, that can present barriers to implementation. So things like a cooling audit, electrical system or panel upgrade, and so on. And I'll just end here just with a note on the importance of not just looking at upfront costs to owners especially, and as well as downstream costs to tenants, but also things like operating costs and taking into the, account the fact that even when cooling exists, there are some households that will feel too financially constrained to even use it. So really thinking about that when we provide financial support as well. So that is all we have for you today. I will turn it over to Natalie in just a moment, and I'm sure there'll be some questions that we'll answer in the chat. I wanted to just throw out a couple for you all, in case we want to have a bit more of a two-way discussion or a multi-way discussion. We're really curious, if you are a designer, are you having more interest in thermal safety cooling or cooling retrofits? Is that something that you're getting more requests for? The priority actions that I presented, did they sound right as a way of starting to accelerate thermal safety retrofits? And what else, if not, what else should we be doing collectively to advance this? So some food for thought, and I will bring it back over to you, Natalie.
Thanks so much, Lisa. I dropped those in the chat just so folks could continue to come back to those. I think we had a lot of activity in the chat, as per usual, quite honestly. Love to see it. I think I will ask the first question to Susan, go back a little bit into the technical pieces. There was some discussion specifically on the measure of 26 degrees, that target. So Raf asked about the appropriateness of that 26-degree target, considering adaptive models like ASHRAE 55. And some other folks in the chat brought up the fact that it's maybe the best thing that we have. And I wonder what your thoughts are on that, and maybe even include another question that spoke about the dehumidification offerings that heat pumps provide, and how do we navigate that cooling and comfort piece of different mechanical systems. Over to you, Susan.
Yeah, and we looked across, like Lisa mentioned, many jurisdictions as to what kind of temperature bylaw they're looking at. And so 26 degrees does seem to be what some of the Canadian jurisdictions are converging on, but there were some cities and locations in the US that are also looking at a differential based on what outside temperatures are doing. So saying, you have to be 10 degrees lower or something like that. And then in other studies, we've also dug into the ASHRAE, adaptive metric, as well as other ones. NRC right now is looking at a lot of health-based temperature metrics. However, they are very complex because they vary based on the person. If you know the ASHRAE metric, it depends on what type of clothing you're wearing. And so then you come up with the question, well, how do you represent the average person? And that's just not our area of expertise. So I think that's where we're getting back to 26-degree dry bulb is an easy one to measure, first of all. You can put a thermometer in, they're cheap, and they're something that, people understand. So it's the easier you can measure it, the easier you can regulate it. And then it's also something that's just kind of consistent. And we were getting, as much as Lisa said earlier, the health authorities were involved in this study. And so they were able to weigh in on that's, generally a representation of a temperature or of a state that's healthy for most people. So, but yeah, there are definitely some better metrics out there, but they can get very complex for actual practically applying them into industry.
Thanks, Susan. I feel like we could spend a lot of time on that question specifically, and there's no one answer. And on that note of complexity, there was a question, as it always comes up, on cost. And Lisa, you did bring that up, near the end of your presentation. Brady asked the question of, is there a future where Clean BC subsidizes some of these overheating studies? Do we feel like that is like the best use of, trying to get folks started on this type of work?
Well, it's quite cheeky coming from Brady, seeing as he was one of the client team members on this project. So I feel like that was a rhetorical question. But certainly, I mean, so I'll just take that in the direction that I want to take it, which is that I do think that that is a reasonable use of funds. And there's, one, because this is emerging as a priority. Summer after summer, we are seeing increasing temperatures, not in a linear fashion, but certainly hot days are here to stay. And we do need to do something to protect folks in their units if they are not, living in thermally safe conditions. I'll also say that, I show that sort of intersection between electrification, decarbonization, and thermal safety. And I'm sure as many folks on the call have noted as of late, there is a little bit of a lack of appetite, shall we say, for as much of an appetite for climate action as there once was, with, competing priorities, tariffs, political changes, uncertainty, and all the rest of it. But what is undeniably important is human health and safety. And so if we can start to achieve, triple win outcomes that we see, improved energy efficiency, improved health and comfort, and reduced emissions through using this as a channel through which we get there, then I think we can hopefully all agree that that would be a good step forward. So yeah, I think at least having an understanding of where those folks are at greatest risk and finding a way to support, at least identifying what those measures can and should be that can help achieve that thermal safety, that also don't inadvertently impact the grid, that also don't increase emissions. That would be a great first step and a great place for initial funding, I think.
Yeah, and that connects actually to, this piece of an urgent need from an equity perspective on getting action moving on this. There was a question from Hamid on portable air conditioning units, and his question brings up this piece that relates a little bit more to maladaptation, but maybe a lighter version of it, in that there are unintended consequences from some of our urgent, immediate actions. So I wonder if, Lisa, you have any thoughts on, how do we navigate these demands that might have, some negative, externalities or ramifications, but also it's meeting the immediate need. And Susan, even from a technical side, how do you balance these things out? There's not one answer, obviously, but how are you thinking through this?
Yeah, I mean, I think like all things, if it was an easy answer, probably wouldn't need a webinar on it. But I think certainly portable units have a place in safeguarding safety first and foremost. Like if there is an actual risk to human health and safety, then there is absolutely a role for those. I'll let Susan speak to like maybe the specs that those ought to have and what level of efficiency maybe we can expect them to embody, but they have to be seen as an interim measure that is part of a larger plan to move us towards something that is ultimately going to be, less impactful on the grid, more reliable from an effectiveness perspective, but also from a user friendliness perspective, from a cumbersomeness dimension. There are lots of folks that have been receiving these that may not necessarily know how to operate them properly or maintain them or keep them functioning. So I think, interim measure, yes, but definitely we want to see sort of like a broader movement towards more fulsome suite of retrofits that achieve those multiple goals, over a reasonable time frame, not expecting everyone to make massive investments all at once, but perhaps focusing in on those that need it most, and then having that longer sort of medium to longer term plan to identify how you're going to gradually transition over to a fully cooled building, for example. But Susan, I don't know, what else would you like to add?
Yeah, exactly. I think that's why we were trying to focus on the sort of planning piece and asking the right questions at the start. And this goes to, I think it was Leslie's question earlier about how do you manage resistance for recommendations when upgrades are needed. And I think you've already touched on it a couple of times, Lisa, but really building on what we already need. And if you look at, Vancouver, for example, Metro Vancouver, just think of the boom that we've had in the 90s and early 2000s. And when those buildings are start to reach, end of equipment life cycle, first of all, if it's typically sort of 15 to 20 years on that, what can we do at that point that's, maybe they had AC units before, can they put in heat pumps that will also heat efficiently? Like, is there a natural switch that we can start thinking of now so that when something starts to fail in 5 years, we're not scrambling and trying to do a quick electrical capacity study and do everything on the spot? And similarly for the envelope, because I think, we all, um, yeah, I think that's going to come due at some point in the near future, and that's going to be, I think, Vancouver's especially real opportunity to look at what we can do for the long term, from an envelope perspective for those buildings needing rehabilitation. So, but it's not cheap, so we can't always find the budget, but at least if we can, there's budget and time, right? So at least if we can try to plan ahead and get the time thing in perspective, then maybe we can see what else is out there budget wise. To Brady's Clean BC questions.
Also, I'll just jump back in on that one again, just to do a quick plug. I mean, there are people who are trying to work on this question as well. Like Shauna Sylvester in her work with urban climate leadership is really trying to take a look at this question, especially from the provision of cooling angle, and is looking at low-rise multi-unit residential buildings in particular. So how can we add cooling? How can we electrify that particular tranche of buildings, including that financial dimension? So she's been doing great work. I also see related to that, the comment from Leslie in the chat around how do we apply this to marginalized groups, low-income families, and so on. I mean, I also want to note that, what few rebates, incentives that do remain these days are geared towards low-income families, thankfully, and we would love to see programs for geared towards thermal safety, targeting those communities more specifically. I also saw Josephine is here from EcoTrust, and she and her colleague Dylan have been doing excellent work on looking at this very particular question of how to protect the most at-risk populations and tenants from overheating in their units. So yeah, it's not just us. Just because we're on the screen doesn't mean we have all the answers. There's lots of folks that are working the problem.
I appreciate that shout out. Building off of Susan, kind of something that you brought up, which is in the presentation, obviously speaking to the engineers in the room, you're going to have to look at a case by case basis. That is, the most challenging part of retrofits. But do you feel like there are any initial, like, I don't know, positive stories about replicability in certain components of some of these buildings, maybe, from the projects that you've looked at? Are there pieces that, oftentimes the replicability is the thing that allows us to do things a little bit more cost effectively. So I wonder if you have seen any of those pieces, and maybe it is the planning piece, but I wonder if you have any reflections on that.
I wish I could say yes, but nothing is really jumping to mind. I think we're still a little bit in the sort of case study phase where there's a lot of analyses going on, but we're not seeing a ton of retrofits in this area. I'd love to be able to check back in a year and have different stories to tell, but um, I keep joking that windows and heat pumps are your two big ones. So if you can, I think, and I don't think that's any secret to anyone, if you can at least get folks kind of thinking about those things, or if you need a window upgrade, then having the thought about what's the incremental cost we could spend to make these twice as good, right? Can you spend 10% more and get twice the performance out of it? That kind of thinking, I think maybe and that is, like you said, the planning piece. But I think that's where the lessons are being learned and hopefully shared with industry through things like these.
I can also just add that speaking of windows and heat pumps, there are now Fresco was, I believe, with the funding of the City of Vancouver, it could be wrong, is exploring the potential of window-mounted heat pumps, or those sort of saddle kind of heat pump units, and their potential, which is, as Susan says, like very much still in the kind of case study exploratory phase, but look like they may have some real promise in, you know, maintaining window operability with relative ease of maintenance where it actually makes sense, like where the building configuration allows. So hopefully Brady will chime in the chat around that, but that's one area that I think is going to be one to watch. Not being an engineer, but I'm still very curious to see how those units will perform.
I also wonder, like, we are in a part of the world that has a more novice or early stage retrofit and renovation scene. We tend to have a history of, building anew and not retrofitting and renovating buildings. And so I wonder if it's also a bit of lack of imagination that, some technologies that exist elsewhere, just we don't know how to ask the question, or many folks don't know how to ask the question of what actually might be possible to do in these buildings. And maybe that does connect to one of the other questions that we're speaking to. How do we convince people? And something you said, Lisa, we have to orient this around less necessarily decarbonization and more about what are the comfort features. And if folks don't know what the alternative is, they've never had cooling in their home, or they don't know how a heat pump can offer more consistent cooling and heating, that comfortable sell. I wonder if that's also a way of coaching people through what is actually possible. Any reflections on that? Just a
Yeah,
smile from
I
Susan.
grew up in Europe actually, and with external blinds, and they were just something that you do every single day, opening and closing them. And I'm glad to see there are a lot more providers on the market these days, and ones who can look at, multifamily and retrofit opportunities. So I do think that there are more things like that coming. As the climate warms, they're going to be less effective, but I think that they're an important placeholder. And then ultimately, when we do have more cooling requirements from a mechanical perspective, they will help, reduce the cooling energy. So, I think there's definitely some opportunities there. Although I do think that a lot of folks are out there looking at that and bringing other technologies over and such. So, a little bit of both.
I'll do one more plug on that before you have to close up, Natalie, which is that if folks are aware, there is the BC Building Electrification Roadmap, which was released in 2016. Nope, 20. Anyway, it doesn't matter. It's being refreshed. And it's taking now a renewed focus on, sort of like what is possible, where should we really be kind of framing our conversations, what are some new fresh ways of thinking about building electrification and by extension cooling. If you see an invitation to one of our workshops coming up to discuss that, please do attend or join us.
Thanks for the pitch, Lisa. That is a very good reminder. And I think this is a good place to stop, even though not every question has been answered from the chat. I just wanted to thank again, Lisa and Susan, you for the great presentations and your frankness in the discussion. I'll remind folks, I'm going to throw a link in the chat for the next Decarb Lunch. It's on decarbonizing rooftop units on commercial buildings. I might even also pitch, even though we have a lot of interest in the Energy Modelers Exchange that Focal and Susan are leading. So keep your eyes peeled for all this great work going on in the network in the Zero Emissions Innovation Center and ZEBx more specifically. So thanks everyone for coming out, and thank you again, Lisa and Susan, so very much for giving your time.
Thank you.